So here's a question for you. If you were sitting in a prison cell, broke, can't make bail, and a guy in a white lab coat walked up and offered you cash, just a couple bucks a day, to let him run some tests on your skin, would you take it? Most guys at Holmesburg Prison did, and what they didn't know was that a few tests would eventually mean viruses, asbestos, experimental drugs, and a chemical so toxic it's still linked to Agent Orange today. The doctor running it all later described looking at the prison yard and seeing, in his words, acres of skin. Not people, not faces, not names. Acres of skin. Stick around, because this one gets worse the deeper you go, and by the end, the guy at the center of it all walks away more famous than ever. Philadelphia, 1951, Holmesburg Prison. From the street, it looked like any other lockup. Concrete walls, guard towers, the usual. But behind those walls were hundreds of men with one thing in common. Most of them were poor, a lot were awaiting trial, and almost none of them could afford bail. Some couldn't even read the forms they were about to sign. To most people, that's just a description of prison life in the 1950s, but to a young dermatologist named Albert Kligman, it looked like something else entirely. Kligman wasn't a warden, he wasn't military, he was a researcher from the University of Pennsylvania, and at first, his work at Holmesburg was about as boring as it sounds. He was studying athlete's foot. But years later, he described the moment everything changed for him. He walked into that prison, looked out at the inmate population, and the only way he could describe it was comparing it to a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. Think about what that actually means. A farmer doesn't see individuals. He sees acreage, land he can use, season after season for whatever he wants to grow. That's how Kligman saw Holmesburg. Hundreds of men, locked behind walls they couldn't leave, broke enough to say yes to almost anything. For a researcher looking for test subjects, that's not a prison, that's a gold mine. And it didn't take long for that gold mine to start attracting some very serious money. Here's the part that's almost hard to wrap your head around. A lot of these men wanted in. Inside Holmesburg, cash meant everything. Cigarettes, coffee, a little extra food, small comforts that made prison life bearable. And for guys awaiting trial, it could mean something even bigger, bail money. A shot at getting out. So when researchers started offering payment for studies, guys lined up. By 1959 alone, inmates at Holmesburg had earned roughly $73,000 combined just from participating in experiments. In a 1950s prison, that was real money, and everybody knew it. On paper, it was all voluntary. That word gets used a lot in this story. But ask yourself this: if you're broke, locked up, and the only people offering you money also happen to control your living conditions, is that really a free choice? Or is it just the only choice you've got? And here's where it gets murkier. The consent forms looked official. Signatures, legal language, the whole deal. But a lot of them never actually named the chemicals being tested. Never explained the real risks. Never mentioned what might show up in your body years down the road. You were agreeing to let someone experiment on you, without knowing what experiment actually meant. What started as patch tests for shampoo and skin cream was about to turn into something much, much bigger. Because once word got out that Holmesburg had hundreds of cheap, available test subjects behind locked doors, the calls started coming in. And not just from skincare companies. Once Holmesburg proved it could deliver fast, cheap human test subjects, it stopped being just one doctor's side project and became something closer to a business. Pharmaceutical companies signed on, so did cosmetic brands, so did government agencies, and eventually, so did the US military. For these companies, Holmesburg solved a massive problem. Recruiting regular volunteers for medical testing is slow, expensive, and full of red tape. But inside Holmesburg, the subjects were already there. They weren't going anywhere. And they'd say yes for a couple bucks. Pentagon records that surfaced years later showed the Army had funded research connected to chemical exposure studies run through the prison. This was the Cold War, after all. And the US was obsessed with anything that might give it an edge if chemical or biological warfare ever broke out. So picture it. On one side of the wall, you've got universities, drug companies, cosmetic brands, and the military, all writing checks. On the other side, you've got men who needed $5 for commissary. And standing right in the middle of it, collecting the contracts, running the studies, building his name, was Albert Kligman. His reputation was growing fast. His funding was growing faster. And one day, a chemical company came to him with a very specific question. What does this substance do to human skin? That question would lead to the darkest chapter in the entire Holmesburg story. Up to this point, you could almost file Holmesburg under shady but typical for the era. Bad consent forms, sketchy ethics, companies cutting corners, disturbing, but not yet the stuff of nightmares. Then came dioxin. In the 1960s, Dow Chemical wanted to know how human skin would react to dioxin, a compound that would later become infamous as one of the most toxic ingredients in Agent Orange, the chemical used to strip the jungles of Vietnam. Dow funded the study, Kligman ran it, and the test subjects were the men of Holmesburg. Not lab rats, not computer models. Men sitting in prison cells who needed cash and trusted the people in white coats. Dozens of inmates took part, but 10 of them ended up at the center of everything, because according to records uncovered years later, those 10 men received a dose of dioxin that was roughly 468 times higher than what Dow had originally authorized. 468 times. The reactions were immediate and brutal. Most of those men developed severe skin lesions, painful, inflamed, impossible to miss. And the study kept going. Years later, people would ask the obvious question, who looked at those reactions and decided to keep going anyway? Nobody had a good answer. By that point, too many institutions, the university, the sponsors, the prison itself, all had a reason to look the other way. But here's the part that still gives people chills. For decades, nobody could say for certain what happened to those 10 men afterward. Nobody tracked their health, nobody followed up. Because the records, the names, the notes, the files that could have answered those questions were gone, destroyed. Imagine that. You agree to a study because you're broke and need the money. Years pass. Your body starts changing in ways you don't understand. And when you go looking for answers, you find out the paperwork connecting you to the experiment simply doesn't exist anymore. As far as the official record is concerned, it never happened to you. While those men were left with nothing, not even proof, Albert Kligman's career kept climbing, and what came next might be the most unbelievable twist in the entire story. Most scandals end when the truth comes out. Holmesburg didn't, because by the time people started asking real questions, a lot of the evidence had already vanished. By the late 70s and early 80s, attitudes toward human experimentation were shifting fast. Congress was holding hearings, journalists were digging. Studies that had been quietly accepted for decades were suddenly impossible to defend. Former inmates started speaking up. They wanted to know who approved this, who funded it, and most importantly, who exactly had been used. That should have been simple. There should have been files, names, consent forms, research notes, a paper trail linking every experiment to every man who took part. But Kligman's records had been destroyed. The names of the men in the dioxin study, gone. Without that paperwork, proving what happened to anyone became almost impossible. And while former inmates hit dead end after dead end, Kligman's reputation only grew. Universities honored him. Journals praised him. He became one of the most respected dermatologists in the country. And then came the twist nobody saw coming. One of Kligman's biggest contributions to dermatology became a household name, Retin-A. Millions of people have used it. For acne, for wrinkles, for anti-aging. It sat in bathroom cabinets all over the world for decades, and almost none of those people have ever heard the words Holmesburg or acres of skin. When Kligman died in 2010, he had never been criminally charged for anything that happened at Holmesburg. No trial, no prison time, no dramatic ending. But the story of Holmesburg wasn't over yet, because one man refused to let it stay buried. For years, it looked like Holmesburg was just going to fade away. A few old records and a few old filing cabinets, slowly forgotten. Then a researcher named Alan Hornblum started asking questions. Hornblum wasn't protecting anyone's reputation or funding. He just wanted the truth, and the deeper he dug, the more he uncovered. University contracts, government paperwork, and former inmates with stories that lined up disturbingly well with each other. In 1998, he published a book about everything he found. He called it Acres of Skin, Kligman's own words thrown right back at the story. For a lot of readers, this was the first time they'd ever heard any of it, and for former inmates, it was something they'd been waiting decades for, someone finally believing them. Lawsuits followed. One former participant reportedly received $40,000 after taking legal action. But in 2000, a much bigger lawsuit, nearly 300 former inmates, was thrown out entirely. For a lot of those men, it felt like the same story all over again. The people with more money and more lawyers came out on top. Still, the story refused to die. And in October of 2022, more than 50 years after a lot of this happened, the city of Philadelphia issued a formal apology. 50 years, half a century, some of these men had been waiting their entire adult lives for someone in power to simply say, "What happened to you was wrong." Around the same time, the University of Pennsylvania quietly removed Kligman's name from a prestigious lecture series and redirected the funding toward dermatology research focused on skin of color. The message was clear. The celebration was officially over. So here's where we land. A doctor walks into a prison, looks at hundreds of human beings, and the words that come to his mind are acres of skin. He goes on to build one of the most successful careers in American dermatology. Pharmacies and bathroom cabinets all over the world right now. He dies in 2010, never charged with anything. Meanwhile, the men who actually took the risks, who had chemicals 468 times the safe dose put on their skin, whose names were in files that somehow disappeared, spent the rest of their lives trying to prove any of it even happened to them. So here's my question for you. Next time you're standing in your bathroom looking at the products on your shelf, how many of them do you think have a story like this one buried underneath? Drop your honest answer below. I read every single one. If stories like this matter to you, subscribe and stay in the vault. Because history's darkest chapters don't disappear. They don't stay buried. They just wait for someone willing to dig them back up. Follow the Ink Vault. We go where the others don't.